I wanted to start, I think, with you, Evan, because you have a great piece that you wrote for Fast Company. I always want to say Fast Times, like Fast Times at Richmond High. And it says, I'm just going to quote you if that's okay. Sure. More money, weapons, and technology in the hands of the Department of Homeland Security, an agency complicit in human rights abuses long before Trump took office, won't stop the rising threat of right-wing violence. Instead, it will be used to suppress legitimate dissent and disproportionately target Black and brown activists, Muslims, immigrant communities, and social movements that effectively challenge systemic injustice and corporate power. More specifically, lawmakers should reject attempts to exploit the crisis Trump created to further one of Trump's top goals, gutting Section 230, a foundational law that makes it possible for websites to host the content, post videos, photos, memes, and opinions of ordinary people. So, can you, unlike the surveillance state, which we don't want to be expanded, can you expand on that?
For sure, Katie. And, I think there's multiple different things to unpack there. So I'll try not to ramble so that we can get other folks in as well. But, I think the first thing I want to say is this is not a slippery slope argument, right? I hear a lot of folks out there saying, oh, this is a slippery slope argument. No, this is an argument that is directly informed by the lived experiences of marginalized people in this country who have been on the receiving end of an oppressive surveillance state that puts people's lives in danger, that puts people's family members in prison, that has gotten people killed, right? So this is not about kind of waving our hands and saying, oh, but what if they go too far and then my friends get censored? This is an actual, something that we need to grapple with. And that we can't ignore. And, I think the thrust of my piece is that we can't combat individual groups of violent white supremacists by doubling down on policies that are based in white supremacy and uphold white supremacy. So expanding mass government surveillance programs, which have been historically weaponized primarily against communities of color, immigrant communities, Muslims, activists that challenge powerful corporations, activists that challenge the police and the government, expanding the government's role, or for example, passing a new domestic terrorism statute, where we've seen historically that such laws criminalize, again, those same folks that I was just talking about. Those types of policies are not going to do anything to prevent another display of white supremacist violence, which is what we saw in the Capitol this week. In fact, they will be enacting white supremacist violence on the communities that have already been the most harmed by this administration and by Trump's supporters and their rhetoric, right? So for me, this is not sort of a trade-offs or, kind of a false equivalency. This is literally about not pushing for policies that actually harm the very same communities that those folks that stormed in the Capitol were trying to silence and disenfranchise.
Moral, kind of like principled arguments aside, there's a very clear strategic argument about the concrete ways this will be enacted, right? This isn't just a question of where you fall on principles. It's actually a kind of a question of interest.
For sure. I mean, I think it's certainly both. And my headphone fell out for a second there, so I might have missed slight context. But to dive in on kind of the second piece of my op-ed, which I think speaks to what you're talking about, let's quickly touch on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, right? So this is a great example where we can and should have robust debates about things like deplatforming and what is the responsibility of big tech companies and their surveillance capitalist business model, or things like algorithmic amplification. What role does that play in assisting white supremacists and fascists with recruitment and amplifying some of the worst content on the internet in this never-ending quest for advertising dollars, right? Those are conversations we should have, and we can have reasonable disagreements about where the lines are or what the best policies are to address the harms that are clearly happening, right? We also can't be the party of hands off the internet, everything is fine, and pretend that there aren't real harms that are being done by these massive corporations and their business practices. That said, we should all be able to agree that ripping up Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act isn't going to fix any of those harms. Sort of wherever you land, whether you think that big tech companies engage in too much moderation and are censoring legitimate political speech, or you think they're not doing enough and they should be taking down more accounts. Either way, ripping up Section 230 won't fix the problem that you have with these companies, right? And so I think this has been a huge, in a lot of ways, distraction from some of the things that we really need, which I would argue are finally passing a strong federal data privacy law that would ban the type of data harvesting and micro-targeting that these companies use to sort of algorithmically inject some of the worst content into the minds of the people who are most susceptible to it and sort of gives them their monopoly power, actually enforcing existing antitrust laws, a host of other options that we have to rein in the power of these companies to break up their monopoly and gatekeeper control, rather than destroying a law that fundamentally is at the core of what enables all the best aspects of the internet, the parts of it that are actually transformative and have given a voice to many people who have been historically silenced in our society and through mainstream media in the past. So, I guess that's my main point. It's like, let's have a real debate about deplatforming. Let's stop fucking like saying bullshit about Section 230. And I would point folks to, many resources and explainers, because in the end, that's one thing, I want to approach the show tonight and our conversations about this with some humility, because I think there is a degree to which, like, I don't know, like, I don't genuinely know, whether if I were sitting behind the controls at a company like Twitter, what I would think is actually the best thing to do about deplatforming someone like Donald Trump. I think there's really valid arguments to be made on a number of sides about, where are the lines? When do we approach that like fire in a crowded theater, kind of carve out that we all understand to be built into the First Amendment. But I do know that ripping up Section 230 isn't going to make this situation any better. So I think that's like a good thing for anyone out there who cares about this to start with, so we can like push that aside so we can actually have the real conversation about what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing.
So you're saying let's table and pause, and there's a lot to talk about, and we shouldn't like be scared off of talking about the other stuff about platforming. But what we can all agree on that's not controversial or shouldn't be controversial is this issue.
Section 230, don't repeal Section 230, because this allows for, basically, what would happen if they repealed Section 230 is it would allow them to, sue Facebook over ads and stuff like that. But then also, if a website was hosting leftists and that, people would be held too far accountable for, what goes on in their services. And that goes all the way to every type of service on the internet.
Yeah, I'll say one last thing on that. And I want to make sure we get Shahid in and others. But, one of the most likely scenarios that I think we are likely to see in the coming weeks would be Democrats to push a piece of legislation that creates a carve out in Section 230 for speech that promotes, quote unquote, domestic terrorism. Right. Mm-hmm. Which on its face sounds perfectly reasonable. OK, we're saying platforms, are protected from liability. But if people are straight up on there calling for domestic terrorism, then like maybe they should be liable. That's sort of the argument behind it. What that would do is it would make it so that any racist asshole could sue Facebook anytime they allow someone to, for example, post a video of police violence and argue that posting that video of police acting violently is inciting domestic terrorism, right? So anything like that, I think, would end up actually crushing the anti-racist and anti-fascist social movements that we clearly desperately need now more than ever. So to make it more concrete, this isn't just about will they repeal it. I think we're much more likely to see kind of these narrow attempts to create carve-outs in it. But many of those carve-outs could be just as devastating as repealing the law entirely. And I think that one is very likely to be coming sooner rather than later. And we need to be ready to wholeheartedly oppose it, and again push for real solutions and real community responses to this very real threat of organized white supremacist violence that is amplified by big tech companies' business models.
Can one of you just give a summary of what it is? Section 230 is
You're the lawyer.
It's a corporate liability shield. It's a shield for platforms, and it protects platforms that host user-generated content from liability based on content that the companies, did not produce. And that sounds like, on its face, a liability shield for the companies, but it's actually a content moderation shield for the users. Because by saying that companies won't be liable for user-generated speech, while companies remain at liberty to moderate content on their platforms, because they're not state actors, so they're not subject to First Amendment protections, they can more or less do whatever they want. As long as 230 is in place, they don't have an incentive to actively police user speech. So what removing 230 would do, that's the scenario that Evan's noting, whether it's repealing or carving it out, any erosions to 230 would basically invite companies to more aggressively police, censor, suspend, and ban user-generated content. And that's a huge problem here. A lot of people are responding to any number of legitimate concerns, including, for instance, the completely unreasonable power of tech companies. And it is absolutely true that corporate content moderation decisions are entirely arbitrary. And I would say, frankly, that the ban of Donald Trump demonstrates it. I don't have a problem with it, particularly because he incites violence. And so that's not constitutionally protected speech, nor is Twitter a state actor. But the point of the arbitrariness absolutely sticks, because it's not like he just started inciting violence. He's been doing this for years. So why now? Why today? Why, based on a series of tweets that themselves aren't even nearly as incendiary as half the other things he's posted?
Right.
It speaks to precisely the fact that the corporate platforms are run amok. They can do whatever they want. And 230 is basically the last vestige of not giving them a reason to do everything they want, or everything that the government might want.